Hello and welcome to another video. In this tutorial, I'll show you my approach to making a speed garage template, the ultimate producer tool to help you make tracks fast and get your music sounding professional. The video covers sample selection, tuning and processing of kicks, snares, hats, effects and more, plus sound design for basses, along with a variety of general tips. I've included a free template in the description inspired by my work in this video, and I'll link some other free resources including some of the other samples used in this video in the description. I'd recommend my Speed Garage Drums video as a companion to this, as it covers some topics I don't mention in this tutorial, like using grooves. I recently released my first Serum 2-pack entitled Pressure Systems, which I'll link below as well. Bear in mind, I've recorded some overdubs in places, so hopefully they're not too jarring. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's get into it. With the kicks, I'll take you through 3 levels of processing complexity. We'll start with bare bones tuning and limiting, move on to more complex dynamic processing, and finally to a multi-chain effect rack. I'll start by dragging the samples into a drum rack. I'll put a pitch on here. I'll program in a kick drum. Now I'm going to decide which kicks I want to keep and which I'll get rid of. Make this a bit longer. They're easy to tune if there's more distance between them, because you can see the tails more easily. This MIDI effect, you can use it as a means of scrolling through the kicks just by going up and down. Don't know how I feel about that one. I don't like that one. That one's going. And I'm going to remove this kick too. Let's start tuning and processing this kick because I feel it has potential, but it's not quite there yet. So we're using span. What you have to do is put it on high res, play, and then you want to hold. Then you can use these sliders to zoom in. And usually I'm looking for the highest amplitude note, essentially. So here it's around, you can sort of see this is the highest peak is here. It's around C2 40 cents. So what that means is you need to go into the kick to the detune, put in -40 so that it gets to a C. So you can see it's right at C now. What I'll do now is I'll often just rename it to C. What I normally do with kicks now is I have a couple of plugins that I use to just try and squeeze their dynamics a bit so that they're a bit louder. So this is G-Clip, and then this is the Smexoscope, which shows you the waveform. Clippers do cause distortion, so that doesn't sound great. If the clipper isn't working how I want it to, I'll tend to use a limiter instead because it has the same effect where it squashes the dynamics. It helps make the kick louder, but it doesn't distort in the same way. What I usually do before this is I add a transient shaper. There's a lot of gain reduction happening, and this type of thing I'm probably going to pull back. Get it to sort of a few dB. Then you can do a before and after. Mess with the look ahead as well. Lower look ahead values tend to lead to more distortion. That sounds a bit distorted to me, whereas this sounds pretty clean. There are other modes you can use like soft clip. You can contemplate taking out some of the maybe lower frequencies as well. But I kind of think this sounds good as it is, to be honest with you. So I probably wouldn't leave the EQ on just to avoid unnecessary processing. The general idea with this is we're making it hit harder. Both with the transient shaper, which you can hear what it does on its own, and then the limiter afterwards. I'm just going to move this to the actual chain. Before, and then after. I can show you some more complex chains as well, but generally speaking, this is my go-to for kicks. I'm trying to get samples that are already 85, 90% of the way there before I'm reaching for processing, and then the processing is just give it a little bit of extra punch, especially because we're listening to kicks in solo. When they're in a mix, they're probably going to lose a bit of clarity because there's going to be other elements, most likely masking. There are ways to fix this as well with side chaining and whatnot, but yeah, this is quite a good starting point. I'll have a look at another. I'm going to select one of the 909 style kicks. Yeah, with these, I will usually turn the snap off. And what I do is I go snap and then I go copy value to siblings, and that gets rid of snap for everything. The snap will cut the sample at the zero crossing. Usually I'll turn the snap off as I feel it's better to be intentional when choosing where a sample ends. Okay, so same again. This one is about -40, so we'll just put +40 again. This is an A now. So we already shortened it. You can also use the ADSR to do this as well. So then maybe here actually it's more useful to have snap on, but you can shorten it like this as well. Then use the decay. I tend to use one-shot mode for kicks, although for other types of samples, I mainly use classic. One-shot is better for fading out sounds more quickly, and this is ideal for kick drums, as kicks with longer tails are more likely to interfere with your sub bass. Doesn't really add anything. Might take the snap off though, so it's a little bit longer. Now I'm going to show a more process-heavy approach to kick processing using some different inserts. We'll start with the transient shaper. Yeah, we'll try some drum bus. you get something a lot more tonal with this than you did before. I like it actually though. Don't know how it would work in a mix, but it does fatten it a little bit. It's one of those things again that solos sounds good, but then in a mix it might be too much, but you try the different algorithms as well. I'm going to bring in Live's Saturator. It's worth experimenting with the positions of dynamics inserts within your channel strip. So you have different modes here. I like the bass shape because it's quite, I think it's like the most subtle maybe. So it's got like a different curve on the basis of the threshold. That's nice. Cyanide fold gets very like syrupy. I think I probably prefer the bass shape, it's a bit more subtle. I don't think it will really clip unless you take it to like 0. Let's see what the dynamics processing does to the waveform of the kick. In all honesty, we're doing quite subtle processing here. So yeah, we'll just do the limiter at the end again, as we did before, and just do a little bit of gain reduction. Before and after. The processed version is much louder, so I'm going to bring in a utility to gain match. That's about the same. I think they're just kind of different to us. I don't actually think one's necessarily better than the other. This is more tonal. This is less tonal. I do feel this feels a tad more modern, but maybe it's also a little bit too glossy feeling for Beat Garage. You might actually want something that's a bit more raw, like a bit more dirty. Finally, I'll process the 808 style kick with a more complex chain. So we'll just tune this quickly. This is a G sharp. Do the same again with the fades. Don't really want that long tail. I'm going to bring in a rack that was originally made for breakbeat kicks, but it tends to work well when trying to modernize 909 style kicks. The processing is a bit too intense, so I'm going to do some further tweaks. So we've got the vinyl distortion this time as well. You can do some interesting stuff with the filters in this. Got an EQ, which you can kind of hear why that's there. But in a sense, actually, you know what? Scale it back a bit. You got this erosion, which actually had some noise. We've also got a compressor here. We have got transient shaping as well. That really changes the tonality. the dry wet down. This I think I was just using for the soft clip. So maybe I'll turn it up, run it into soft clip, but that's not actually working at the moment, which means I need to add more level, more transient. The boom adds low frequency enhancement, which can be used to emphasize the fundamental frequency of a kick. This kick is a G sharp, so I'm going to snap the boom to G sharp. Probably don't want to do that. You can make the decay shorter. You can see it's still just behind the kick if I get rid of this. Then you'll see little kind of few squiggles. So you might want to resample this if you were going to do it, or you can just have a shorter decay. But honestly, I'd prefer that anyway. I am going to add a little bit of level going into the glue compressor though. I don't really want any gain reduction. Just want the soft clip. Part of me wants to take this harmonic down as well, because it feels like a bit unevenly loud and a bit like ringy. I'm using vinyl distortion in parallel here, using 2 separate chains. I'll take this down a bit. And then normally what I'll do is you have the effects chain. Then we have the clean chain. And then I'll usually just mix the effects chain down. And then you sort of get a best of both worlds thing where you get the tonality of the FX kick, which is probably a bit too much on its own. But then you get the clarity of the clean kick. Generally speaking, you want your kicks to be in mono. You certainly want the low end of your kicks to be in mono because they'll translate better to club sound systems if they're in mono. It's the closest thing I think there is to a rule in bass music production or in music production in general that your bass should be in mono. So what you want to look for with samples, you'll see it here. So there's some kind of stereo element happening with this kick. And it's probably the transient. And you can see this with a stereoscope. That shows the stereo image. So in theory, if patch is entirely in mono, it should show it as a 100% straight line. But for some reason, it doesn't always show it like that. So if I put a utility over here now and I mono it, it comes up as a completely straight line. Whereas before you can see it's not quite there. Again, this sample is very slightly stereo. Let's check some of the other kicks. This one doesn't look stereo at all. Oh, it is at the end. Mine will be 100% mono, I know that. Yeah, you can see now the line is 100% straight. What you do probably need to do is put a utility at the end and just mono the bass. There are other things you can do as well, like only having a left channel playing or only having a right channel playing. It's not a bad thing to have them not 100% in mono. I'll post a great mono mixing video in the description. Again, snap off. With related siblings. I'll usually normalize my samples within each cell of a drum rack. Although normalization won't mean all your samples are identical volumes, it does increase the likelihood of them being closer volume-wise. The chains are an efficient way of muting and soloing multiple cells at the same time. Tempted to actually check this in mono. That still sounds all right, I think. Maybe you want to mono the basses of the claps as well. The way I conceptualize mono mixing is that you want the mono mix to be as close to the stereo mix as possible, but you also want some width in your stereo mix. I'd recommend using reference tracks for mixing to help with this. I'm going to add a limiter here to squash the dynamics a bit. This ensures everything is at the same level. Now I'm going to use an EQ to remove some of the lower frequencies, which we don't need. Claps don't generally need to be tuned because they're made from noise, which means they're not tonal. There are exceptions to this, like if a clap is layered with a snare or processed in a certain way. Some of these, I've listened to that one as well. I'm like, oh, maybe that is like a wee bit bright. Quite saturated, so we'll bring this in and calm that down a little bit. That clap sounds too wide as well. I feel like this clap tricks you into thinking it sounds good by being extra wide. I'm not saying it's like a bad sample. I'd almost take the width down a bit. This is a great free plugin for widening. Just to give it a bit more fullness. Again, similar situation with this one, I think. Maybe just try this on here as well. Part of the reason I'm going through them is I'm getting an idea of what I want to use on them to process them. And I might just use a little bit of drum bus. Then we'll use it in parallel. Makes it a bit dirtier. You don't have to have this. You know, you don't have to have the limiter either. These are a mixture of rimshots and snares. Let's drag them into a drum rack. Again, we'll put the sample in. This sample is very stereo, and it may have been 2 snares layered. Maybe panned as well, like you can tell with the utility if you put it to the left and right. It sounds pretty similar. Maybe it's just widening. They've done some kind of widening on it. When making a template, I'll probably tune all the snares. This is a very similar process to the kicks. So that's plus 35, let's call it. So you do minus 35. This snare is an E. Some snares you'll get that are more like this though, where it's a bit difficult to sort of tell. You know, it's almost more like a clap. I mean, how would you go about tuning this? Sometimes EQs will give you a more accurate readout than spam. That one, maybe if you're being really, you know, I might go and tune this one and be like, okay, well, this is a F sharp minus 25. So I'll put it at plus 25. And then, you know, we'll look at it again and it will be F sharp and you can call it rim F sharp. Let's keep going through the snares. I wonder with snares like this, whether or not they might be useful for sort of background percussion stuff. This one is decent, but it's too quiet again. I think it's not been normalized. You got that tail as well. So maybe if I heard a tail like that, you know, you can use these envelopes. Has all this noise afterwards, so something like that might be better. But then it feels a bit short, so in this case, the snare's tail helps make the sample feel grittier, which is appropriate for speed garage. These samples are from one of my free packs, which I'll link in the description. So they are labeled with a key. These ones you don't have to worry. I always find myself using this one. I don't know why. It's from like an MPC pack, I think originally. This system's very stereo, as you might be able to hear. It's like super duper wide. It does actually sound like it's two different samples, yeah. Don't know how I feel about it. I kind of just like the left one actually. We could do similar processing to what we did before. At least we want to put an EQ on there. Maybe we want to drag this to this individual rimshot. So it's not affecting everything because I don't want everything to be just the left channel. You can do more, you know, you could start clipping stuff. Add a bit more grit to some of these samples. Like I quite like that. It sort of adds a bit more harmonic distortion. Has a bit more bite. But then other samples, the clipper is squeezing the life out of the snare a bit too much. Maybe a little bit. We'll kind of see how it goes. If you start making drums with it and the snares sound a bit off, then maybe take the clip off, or you can just turn it off altogether. Usually with clippers and stuff on drum racks like this, I'd probably put it on at the end. This is because clippers and limiters reduce dynamic range, increasing a sound's loudness, and this is part of the reason I'm using them. Let's have a look at how to use choke groups. You can hear the samples are playing one after the other. I go and I put them in choke group 1. Can you hear that that first one is muted immediately as the second one plays? Now that the choke group is working, the playhead stops midway through the sample as soon as the other hat is triggered. If you mute the hat in the choke group, you can use it as a silent choke. Now, if I turn it off, you can hear the whole thing. And I think the reason for it goes back to the idea that if you're playing an open and a closed hi-hat on a drum kit, you wouldn't be able to play an open and a closed hi-hat at the same time because you only have one hi-hat and the hi-hat is either open or it's closed. Let's keep going through these. We'll do the snap thing again. Oh, I like this one. This one's really roomy. Stereo as well. There might be some wisdom in having a separate crash drum rack and then a separate one just for hats and then one maybe for like rides and crashes. But for certain genres like grime, you could have a dedicated shaker rack, but here the hats and shakers are together in one rack. One of my ones, I quite like this one. Very short hi-hat. Shaker, another hat. I'm going to tune some of the hats, but this isn't really necessary. Tuned hi-hats in the past. I mean, you could sort of look at this and be like, well, actually, this one is here, and you could say that it's D6, and you could say it's plus 23, and that therefore you need to take this down by the cents value. Then we can call this hat open D. There is a rack that I put on, I tend to find quite useful in terms of crusting up the drums a bit, and it's this Object Redux Final sat rack. This rack was made in an older version of Live, so I'm going to bring in the new version of Redux. You can mess with the dry wet as well, but the idea is it just makes it that bit more gritty. You hear it better with that one. This sample's very bright. We can make a parallel chain here and take the wet channel down. You kind of get the best of both worlds. You get that sort of thicker, dirtier layer. If you want to be really surgical about it, you can stick a utility here and maybe take this down by like 1.5 dB, and then group these together. Sort of do an A/B. This one's still a bit louder, it feels like. Yeah, hopefully you can hear how it sort of darkens it a little bit and gives it a little bit more character. And then you might also want to just get rid of some of that low frequency stuff. The Redux actually adds quite a lot of that. You can also, move this around a bit. You'll get slightly different distortion characteristics. Having an additional perk rack for congas, bongos, and other perk hits could be a good idea for Speed Garage, but I haven't made one here. Here I'm going to use an 808 to demonstrate how to tune a bass sample. I'm adding a tuner here. We'll drag the sample into Simpler. Set it to monophonic or one voice. So there's no phase interference between different notes. Then you can whack a tuner on here. And, you put your note in. I want to start my bass line on G, let's say. So I put this G note in. But the G note is actually a D. That's obviously not what you want. So you don't have to use the transposition here. Now every note we play will be at the right pitch relative to the MIDI piano roll. This sample is a bit sharp. Let's use the sense to fine tune the sample. It only goes 50, minus 50 plus 50. Let's try minus 5. Okay, that's too much. So maybe try like minus. Literally minus 2 in this case, but you can see that. Remember that if you don't warp your samples, higher notes will be shorter and lower notes will be longer. You can warp these samples if you want each note to be the same length. A lot of the sounds in Speed Garage are quite warpy. You do this in Serum with this add seconds waveform. I kind of rushed through this, but yeah, turn the oscillator on. You go to digital. You go to add seconds. You take it down by 2 octaves. Let's increase the attack and the release. And make sure Serum is monophonic, and then you can just get an LFO with the default settings for the moment. Put it on envelope. And then we can mess with the shape of the LFO. It's obviously quite high at the moment, so maybe you want to. That's kind of the essence of a lot of the sounds in the genre. You can use this. Put it to hertz. Setting LFOs to hertz rather than tempo will mean the timing of a parameter will be the same regardless of a project's BPM. You can also do things like changing the random, for example. Will keep the sound more consistent. Let's see what happens when we increase the unison. sort of another sound that you'll hear, you know, another element of the sound. This sort of, oftentimes you just hear this, but I actually kind of prefer this in a sense. You can achieve a similar effect to the unison with the chorus, which I'll show you later. Or you can also get sounds sometimes that are like the opposite. So you can change this to just reverse. You'll hear that as well sometimes. You can also try more experimental LFO shapes. I'll change this back to a saw. You can still try and do this with a square wave and a filter. So we can get this and put it on filter, put B to the filter, change it to unidirectional. It's worth experimenting with different filters as well. So you can start to get something that resembles it. I'm going to go back to one of the more conventional low-pass filters. It's not quite the same. I mean, you will hear this one used quite a lot as well. Doesn't quite have that warpiness. I mean, even if we're still putting it through the filter as well. We can also use the smooth interpolation for smoother transitions between frames of the wavetable when modulating our wavetable position. I'm just going to bypass this for the moment. So this is just a sine wave. Just think of it as a sine wave. And then we're just going to use another. We'll use the same one, but we'll just think of it as another sine wave as well. We can make a warper with sine waves and FM synthesis. This is a good introductory patch to try and make when learning FM. You have two almost identical. So the only difference right now between these two is that this has been taken down by 2 octaves. This is down by 1 octave. The level has also been taken down in oscillator C. You want to go to the warp menu knob. So there's a whole array of different features here. So we're going to use FMC, so FM with C being the carrier, A being the operator. I'll link a video in the description that explains the basics of FM synthesis. We'll just take the filter off for a second. So you can hear. Get some good different tones, even that tone starts to feel a bit kind of warpy almost. You can also mess with the octaves of this, give you a different sounds. So, and then you can start modulating this. So you're getting something a bit similar to the warper. That's a full bar. We'll try a half bar. We can experiment with different filter shapes. These are like EQs. So this is 6 dBs per octave of a cut. This is 12. This is 18. This is 24. They'll kind of have different vibes. And then we can mess around with some FM. But I'm going back to that add seconds waveform for a more classic warper. Let's have a look at some effects. Usually for a sound like this, you maybe want to put the filter on post. You want to have it kind of relatively low and you can sort of experiment. If you want to hear just this filter and the distortion on its own sound, you can take the mix all the way up. So you can hear there's a bit more bite to that now. It's quieter though. But maybe you want to pull that back. You can sort of see it with and without, and you can also experiment with stuff like the hyperdimension. So, I mean, I might whack a compressor in here and then just stick it on multiband and put it at like 10% or something. Just to sort of compress the sub a bit. And then you can also try chorus. And usually what I'll do is I'll switch it from low pass to high pass because I don't really want it working on just the lows. I'd rather it working on the higher frequencies. And just sort of mess with it. I like to do it with the mix all the way up so I can hear what's happening. That is a very similar thing to doing this. You can kind of hear, you get like a similar vibe as well. It's a bit more controllable doing it this way though. I'm going to add one of Serum 2's utilities to help ensure the sound is mono compatible. It's more like the original one when it was a quarter note because we've taken it down by about a half. I mean, you can see here, the amount at the moment is 58%. So for example, if you were like, okay, I want exactly the same amount of warping, but at the moment it's a half note. So you could change this to a quarter note and then you could half 58. So half of 58 is 29. And then if you put this to quarter, it'll be the exact same amount of warping going on. Which I actually think is weirdly sounds like a bit much now. Obviously you get slightly different flavors. I might actually put the attack up a bit on this sound as well because it kind of fades in. So, you know, if you've got a sound that has a bit more of a longer attack. I'm going to show you how to do the subs for these basses. You have to do routing. Serum 2 has a lot of these options. It has different buses. So what I'm going to do, you can see oscillator A, right? It's going into filter 1. And then from filter 1, it says M. M means main. So main is this. Think of it as like the master output. So this is almost like Serum's version of your main. And then within Serum, you have buses, which are a means of routing and summing sound generators. In this case, I'm using them to separate different frequency areas for the bass sounds so I can process them independently. What I normally do, right, is so I have basses with separate sine wave subs. A lot of the time, you don't have to do this for Speed Garage. What we're going to do, at the moment, this is the sub, right? You can hear it's just a sub. It has effects on it at the moment because the effects are running into the main. So technically it has compression. Technically it has chorus over it, but it is only the sub. What we're going to do is turn that off as well. And we're just going to focus on oscillator A now. And then we're going to sort out the sub. So oscillator A at the moment is going to the main. So what we're going to do is we only want it to go to this bus 2. So on filter 1, you can just do this direct on the oscillator, but you can put it on main or direct. At the moment, it's just going to the filter, not going to the buses either. You can see they're both zeroed. We're going to make it go just only to bus 2. Now we need to route the filter to none. Now if we go over to the effects, let's split the frequency areas. We have to drag these inserts across in reverse order. Now we have the effects from the main and they're just on bus 2. And you'll see what we do with bus 1 and the sub in a sec. But we'll use a splitter low-high. And this splits the frequencies up. So we only have frequencies. It's going to be below 100 hertz is usually the cutoff point that I've been choosing recently. Frequencies below 100 hertz go into a low band and frequencies above 100 hertz go into the high bands. We only want the frequencies above 100 hertz because below 100 hertz is going to be filled in by the sub. Then you go to the lows, which is below 100 hertz. You add a utility and then you turn the level of the utility down. And now, if I take this utility off, you can process this top layer. I've kind of processed it in the same way to what I was doing before. Alt drag, and then you can clone it. So, maybe you could, for example, get some overdrive. You want a bit more kind of mid-range. Not making a huge difference there, but just like... We'll do the sub now. So the sub, we're going to take it. We're going to do the same again. So none, except this time it's going to bus 1. You suddenly notice that the sound has its sub back. What I've been doing on here is I will load a preset for this. So sine subchain. This is a compressor first. So just to try and make sure everything's nice and consistent. That's the compression amount. You can see not that much is happening in terms of that. Then we have a splitter again, the low-high splitter, which has exactly the same settings as the low-high splitter on bus 2. The only difference is this time the utility turning everything down is on the highs instead of the lows. So in this one, we're turning down the lows. So the lows are taken up by the sub. And this one, we're taking down the highs because the highs are taken up by the top, which is on bus 2. And then everything comes out the main. One thing of note with this is that I have turned it up by about 6.5 dB because I always find that the subs feel a bit quiet, but this one feels a bit loud actually. We'll reinitialize the preset. This is an anti-stasis waveform, so we're going into digital, selecting anti-stasis, down by 2 octaves again. Doesn't sound like too much on its own. Yeah, it sounds a bit cooler like that, and you get something a bit more Reese. So now we're going to copy with mods. And then we'll paste it. We'll take this to -15 and then +15. I might put it on 3 actually instead as well. I'm going to start from both of them from 0. Let's make a speed garage style bass pattern. Here I'm changing LFO 2 to 3. Then we'll use 1 LFO for each oscillator's wavetable position to add some randomness to the texture of our bass. You can try further as well, like maybe 20 and minus 20. So this is creating this detuning sort of phasing. Now, if we bypass the wavetable modulation, you can hear it's still kind of Reese-y. You can use a smooth function to smooth these out. You can see it creates like a new shape. Like putting the key tracking on. So with the key tracking, the higher the note you play at the keyboard, the more the filter opens, and you'll see that here. You see it's jumping up with those high notes. And you'll notice when I open span again, can you see the way that that note is kind of going up and down quite a lot? It will do when the high note's played specifically, but even just when the low note's being played, you can see it's doing a lot of that stuff. So this is kind of like a half fix when I add a sub. It will be more consistent, but it's still kind of going up and down. And this is a scenario where I would use a sine wave sub to make sure that everything's nice and consistent. Having said that, there are definitely producers in the genre that don't do that. They prefer more of like a warbly bass, and that can sort of work well sometimes in its own way. Be the same process as before in a sense, so you could try a little bit of multi-bands, distortion. You can add chorus. Chorus is pretty good for bringing things to life. You can sort of experiment with some different numbers here as well, like minus 25, 25. I think I prefer a bit lower, so let's try minus 18. The wavetable modulation may be a bit much here. You can also fine-tune modulation amounts in the matrix using the outputs. Now we're going to split the frequency areas. Same again, this one to num, and then to bus 2. And then we'll put the sub to bus 1 and split a low high, 100. And then we want a utility. Here I'm going to load a preset effects chain with a splitter on it. I have also started doing a thing recently where I put on a limiter. So if you turn the ratio all the way, then it becomes a limiter. This is at 0. It's just to make sure it doesn't get too loud. But then the problem is that you could be pushing really, really hard into the limiter, which will fuck up the sound. For a Reese bass like this, it makes sense to have a separate sublayer. Detuning the fundamental subtones of basses can make the sub a bit unwieldy, as I showed earlier in this video, especially once you start mixing, since having more consistent sub levels makes mixing your kick and bass easier. However, having a more wobbly, phasey sub is a stylistic choice. With the effects and stuff like this, good to have impacts particularly. I sort of think of them a bit like punctuation in music, if that makes sense. When loading effects into my drum racks, I avoid dragging in tempo sync samples because tempo sync samples are easier to manipulate on an audio channel. It's not to suggest that I won't have stuff that is sort of in more of a defined tempo. But I always think with, I mean, like that, for example, that's the type of thing that I'd put in a rack because it's short. It's not really tempo synced in any meaningful way. The spin back sample is so fast that it's not really tempo synced. This downer, for example, you could definitely put in. Putting risers in drum racks can make them difficult to position relative to the grid, so I generally favor using them on audio tracks. You can do stuff where you drag this in. I want this to be a certain length, so I'll warp it, and then I will say I want it to be 8 bars. So now this has been stretched so that it will be 8 bars long, and then you can half it to 4 bars. You can double it to 16 if you want. That is maybe a better use of time-based effects. But yeah, the shorter ones, it can be a bit, something like that. I'm aligning the transient impact of this sample using the grid. Now when I put the metronome on, you'll hear that the sample has been synced. You can hear that how that hits on the 1 now. So something like that I wouldn't be particularly keen to put in an effects rack. This is maybe one of those hits that is, because it's a siren, can be a bit out of time. It's not a problem. Something like this I might put in. All of this is useful stuff to have in the rack because even if it's not time synced, you can always just be like, okay, show in browser, and then you can just like drag it out. With ones like this as well, like this is obviously with a delay, but you could just do literally that and then drag it in. And then you could do the same thing with the other one as well, where you just have one of the sample. Then we can do a little fade on the sample. I'm adding some samples to racks that I might not ordinarily add to demonstrate how to warp these samples in Simpler so that they're in time with the project's BPM. You can always be like, okay, well, it's going to end maybe here, and I'll actually warp it and I'll make it like 2 beats, and then although this whole thing is 2 beats. Yeah, if you wanted to actually make it so it's 2 beats, you'd have to crop it first, then you'd have to click 2 beats again. But again, with something like this, I'd probably just bring it out as audio because I think you're going to have a better job synchronizing it. The general idea is, yeah, if you've got something that you need to line up at the end of a section, it's generally easier to do in audio. I mean, even if it's really time synced, like it was like a drum fill or something. They're not going to be synced to the BPM of the track. So there are ways you can do this by using the warp function and then clicking 4 bar. It will then stretch it so it's 4 bars long. It is 4 bars long, which can be useful for certain sounds. Changing between different algorithms will affect the texture of the sample. You can also half it and double it as well. Even stretching them a little bit, you can get some weird kind of textural stuff going on. But I mean, with a sample like this as well, you don't have to warp it. Now I'm going to show you how to make some noise impacts and rises in Serum 2. Serum 2 has some new noise sounds built in. I usually use the bright white because I find myself brightening noise a lot anyway. So I'm like, well, I might as well use a sample that's brighter to start with. This first effect is a noise burst. You can hear that kind of noise burst effect. I make these mono because you're not going to be playing multiple notes of noise at the same time. I'm going to add chorus for some width and character. We'll add reverb too. Let's experiment with putting the amp envelope on the mix. We can also do a rising LFO envelope so the sound gets more reverb as it tails off. Yeah, so that's kind of a very basic noise impact. You can obviously use lots of samples within Serum to get some cool textures with this. You can do a lot of sidechain stuff as well in here. So click through these. You can also do a filter sweep down. I forgot to route the noise to the filter here, so I'm going to fast forward through this part. We need to route the noise to the filter to hear this. This is probably a bit like dramatic for for speed garage, especially in terms of the resonance, but you kind of get the idea. I do like the sim loop because I think it is based on a drum machine ride, and it's just like a nice alternative. Now let's make a noise riser, this time using the bright white noise. Let's tweak the amp envelope so the sound ramps up slowly. We'll do your classic noise riser here. So we'll load the sort up LFO shape and apply it to the filter's cutoff. Sometimes you'll get this bipolar modulation. You want to press Command Shift. We'll tweak the rate of the LFO as well. I'm going to add an EQ to thin out the muddy low mids. Next, I'll add a reverb, and I'm going to choose this nitrous algorithm. And we can put LFO1 on the mix. We've got stuff like the chorus, which I showed you before. You obviously got like the delay as well. Be nice to put a bit of ATT style compression on. A distortion as well, just to get a bit more bite out of it maybe. Bringing the distortions filter down can help these sounds feel less harsh. But in this case, I'm going to use an EQ to brighten. In a mix, it sounds all right on its own, but in a mix, it'll probably feel a bit like not bright enough, I suppose. For impacts, actually, I use a lot of pre-made stuff in general. I will often supplement them with stuff like this. That sounds nice on its own, and even if you can change it to the bright white. That's a bit kind of harsher, but it still works pretty well, and it's still kind of pretty effective on top of an impact. There's a great strings sound in Spitfire Labs, which is free. This just on its own. You hear it sidechained a lot as well, often with something like Kickstart. And that's the video. Please leave any questions in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.